All right, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. My name is Jesse Wieland. I'm the Associate Director at the Office of National Fellowships. And Keith, if you'd like to quickly introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Keith McCall. I'm the Assistant Director of the Office of Graduate Fellowships and Awards. We're also in the same building as ONF and just one floor up, but I do most of the advising for Fulbright with graduate students.
Yeah, and then obviously we focus on the undergraduate side of that. My colleague Bonnie Garcia Glockner is going to join us in just a little while. She's wrapping up another appointment. But we're excited for all of you to join us today to learn a little bit more about the English teaching assistantship experience through Fulbright. And so we have a lot of questions to get to, but first I want our two panelists. Unfortunately, Emily Galan couldn't be here due to a scheduling shift, but she emailed me all of her responses to the questions that we have. And so when appropriate, I'm happy to share those as well to add perspective. But Aria, would you like to briefly introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, and then turn it over to Brian?
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Aria Holden. My pronouns are she or hers. I'm joining you here actually in Christchurch, New Zealand. So I'm a little far away right now. But yeah, my background basically, I've lived a total of 2.5 years of my life in Asia. My Fulbright experience was in Uzbekistan, so that's in Central Asia, north of India, south of Russia, and west of China. And my experience with teaching goes beyond that as well, as I'll actually continue teaching in a little bit, and I can share that in a little bit as well. But that's just my general background for the moment. And at Florida State, I graduated in May 2020, and I got my Bachelor of Science in Anthropology. And I'll pass it over to Brian.
Hey y'all. So Brian Menard, pronouns are he, him. I graduated from Florida State back in 2017. I had to do the mental math. Studied psychology, minored in sociology, and then had a little bit of a winding journey since graduating that brought me through into working in policy for a little bit in Tallahassee through the Florida Gubernatorial Fellowship, and then I went abroad for the Fulbright ETA, which I'm glad it's mostly ETA. I can't really speak to the study program. But that took me to Nairobi, Kenya. I was out there for 9 months back in 2019, returned to the US for graduate school, got my master's at The Ohio State University in higher education, student affairs, and then now work in leadership development and coaching out in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I currently live. So a little bit of wine, but I love this program. I love ONF, I love FSU. So I'm excited to talk to y'all today.
Yeah, Brian, I'm having to do the mental math as well because I think you were one of my first Fulbright students that I worked with back when. So crazy how time passes. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. And the first question that we have today is, can you both talk a little bit about your experience with education, leadership, or mentorship prior to your Fulbright application, and how did you leverage those experiences in the application itself?
Okay, I saw that nose goes, so I will go first. My experience prior to my Fulbright application with leadership or mentorship mainly started at Florida State. So at Florida State, I had a few different programs I was a part of. Mainly the Europe program was something that really instilled leadership and teaching skills into me as an undergraduate student. I was a Europe co-leader for the social sciences cohort, as well as a Europe leader trainer in my senior year spring semester, I would say. Only reason I'm getting a little blurred because it was May 2020 when I graduated. So, that semester was kind of all over the place. But essentially, that was my experience in the teaching mentorship role, as well as I did a few other different things. I was also a part of Peace Jam, which I'm not sure if it's still there, but it was a part of the global engagement aspect or element of Florida State, and mainly focus on international students and how to be engaged going abroad or how to be cross-cultural with people who are from different areas of the world. So that was also another element of something that I kind of dived into when I was there, as well as I did a few other different things regarding leadership with mentoring, tutoring. I'm also a care student alumni, so that was also something I dived into a little bit more as a care student mentor toward like my third or fourth year there. So that was something I did at Florida State. Once I left Florida State, I actually joined AmeriCorps and I was an AmeriCorps member for 2 years in the state of New Hampshire, just south of Canada. And my role was mainly working at an education nonprofit. And then in my second year, I was an AmeriCorps leader. So essentially, I helped the manager and supervisor of our program overseeing all of our AmeriCorps members in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, the northern New England area. And that was also a way for me to foster my leadership skills because I really learned how to communicate with people from all different parts of the US. And I learned a little bit more about US culture prior to applying to Fulbright. I actually applied to Fulbright twice. My first time I was an alternate, and then my second time I was a finalist. So when I was an alternate, I also applied for a program called Princeton in Asia, and that's when I spent a year in Kyrgyzstan teaching at the university level at the American University of Central Asia. So I actually had more teaching experience regarding specifically the region I was applying for my Fulbright, and I think it really transferred well into my leadership role as a Fulbright in Uzbekistan that I can explain a little bit later.
You're unlocking so many memories, but it's really cool how you kind of like showcase the build on there. Because my experience is very similar. I'm even thinking about how the Europe program was like a big piece for on the study side, like going through as a student, seeing other student instructors, and then coming back as an instructor in that program as well. But in my space is more arts and sciences. Outside of that, too, when we think about engagement, volunteering, leadership development, I spent a lot of time at the Center for Leadership and Social Change, as well as right next door in the Counseling Center through the Renew program. And so with volunteering a lot of my experience wasn't formal education. And many of the Fulbrighters I did meet during the program weren't also, they weren't career educators. Some of them were, and they also had that background. But you really do gain a lot of opportunities at FSU to build that more formal, facilitating in front of a group, speaking with students, being present, engaging with community, and that incredibly valuable, and it can't be like understated enough. And so building on a lot of that experience, another piece that was really big to my experience too was really more focused on leveraging the community, leveraging the network of Fulbrighters, alumni as well, which was key in applying for the experience and also being sure I covered my bases because, and this is something that I encourage you all, leverage as much as possible. Outside of the advisors, I mean, I worked with Jesse, obviously. I will talk all day about how great that experience was, but the program, the FSU alumni, or even the ETA alumni who've been to your host country or the country you're applying to, most of the time, in my experience, were incredibly receptive to talking about both how to prepare on the educational side, the pedagogy side, but then also how to speak to the application, tell your story fully. And if you are worried about, hey, I've got all these experiences at FSU or these networks that I can tap into, but you're more concerned about how do I tell that story and bridge it into the host country, outside of what Ari already describes, those alumni, those networks, they're pretty excited to tell their story and help kind of bridge that gap for you. So take advantage of those pieces as well.
In addition to what you said, something that Emily noted in her responses that I think is really valuable was emphasizing ingenuity, adaptability, transferable skills. And she would be the first. She had experience in leadership. She was an orientation leader, and I remember one of our early conversations when she was working on this application. I say this as a former orientation leader myself, is I've never seen that experience because of how complex it is be told succinctly and effectively in a Fulbright application. So what we focused on was how do we dilute her experience to those elements, like the experiences and, like I said, those transferable skills that fit very well into this type of experience. And Ari, that's a really sweet note that she was your OL back in the day. It shows just how interconnected this Florida State community is. But to transition into our next question, and of course, quickly note, if any of the attendees, if you have questions as we're going through this, feel free to type them into the chat. Keith is going to monitor that, and we can fold these into the questions that we already have built. But our next question is, how did you tackle the pedagogical question in your statement of purpose? I know that for this year's cycle, the statement has changed from prior years, so brevity is going to be key to an even greater degree. How did you tackle the pedagogical questions, and how did you make your ideas and methods age appropriate and country specific for Fulbright?
I don't mind starting off here to switch up a bit, but This is building on what Emily mentioned, truly leverage a lot of what your experience is, but try to tell that story. And when I speak to that, I mean, back when I was studying psychology, working at FSU, I was also doing some through UROP, child clinical psychology research. And so I had a lot of experience and exposure to working with younger children, understanding their learning styles. Of course, as a psych student, I also understood a little bit more about child development, did a lot of volunteering in the community as well with children at summer camps and such. And so really knew, understood that age group. I also at the time had interests, of course, got my master's in higher education in working with college students. And so there was some understanding, some interest across a range of age groups. And when I was applying to Kenya, I knew that there were also placements in a range of school settings, which got hard to speak to because you've got that limited space, as Jesse mentions, to talk about how you can impact, how you can engage with a population of students that may be very different from the population you're placed with. And so I had to try to succinctly, as he puts it, tell that story of the experience I have working in developmental settings, working with children, but then also translating some of that creatively with adult learners or young adult learners, so to speak. And the biggest thing that helped me because I didn't have that formal ed experience was trying to speak from my experience, but then also digging and researching into teaching methodologies just in general, what might work, but then also the administration, the school system in the host country too, to at least show that I have that understanding and I'm interested in applying what I know to that country. And again, like I mentioned before, not everyone who goes to Fulbright becomes a career educator or wants to stay within education necessarily. Within, if your country does do like a pre-orientation, there is some training that is pretty slight on lesson planning, on instruction, but most of that is really going to be you trying to learn it yourself, you trying to understand it, you understanding your host country. And this is the part where I emphasize, I imagine you're all taking this pretty seriously, but for me, it wasn't until I actually got into my host country that I realized how important it was to show up and be a good educator. Because for a lot of the students, like that's the environment being in that school, especially if it's a more competitive country or more competitive school, like that education for them could be, I don't want to say make or break, but it's critical for them to get that development and grow. And so if you're in that place as an educator, it is really a bigger onus on you to prepare, but there's also that hopefully internal kind of pressure and kind of guidance to want to show up for those students because it is their education. In the same way, if you had an instructor growing through K through 12, so to speak, you had an impactful educator yourself.
I love that we're mixing it up, Brian. I feel like we should do a little back and forth. I like that. I like that. I was just taking a quick browse at my statement of grant purpose because I haven't looked at it in quite a bit. And my Fulbright actually was in 2023, 2024, so it was fairly recent. I finished it last July, but because I applied twice, my first application looks significantly different than my second application. And I work with Jesse significantly to craft a different element of my story. Because I feel like when I was applying for a lot of these positions, because my first time I applied for Fulbright, I was also applying for Princeton in Asia, Volunteers in Asia, which is a similar program, but based out of the Bay Area of California that had a Stanford connection when it originally started. So they were very similar programs, except of course they weren't government programs. And I wanted a different way to kind of angle my story. I know that there is now a change, as Jesse mentioned, in the application where things are now more succinct and more precise. I would say that kind of mirrors my EPIC application, which EPIC is the English program in Korea. It is their government program to teach English in South Korea. And when I applied this past February, they also completely changed their application. That section specifically used to be essays and now they were short answers. So I had to figure out, okay, how do I navigate this new change and kind of chunk up something that I would usually put into a page essay, for example, right? And I would say that what I focused on when I did my statement of grant purpose was really focused on four things. First, I focused on where the country was heading educationally. When people think about education, they don't really think about Uzbekistan. And I feel like it is one of those areas where there really is a concerted effort to make a change in the classroom. And not just at the K through 12 level or the equivalent, but also in the university system. Because I knew that when I applied for Uzbekistan, their main focus was placing ETAs at the university level, which I appreciated because I had a little bit of experience with that in Kyrgyzstan, but I also really like working with university students and really teaching that age group because I feel like there's a lot that I can transfer over as someone who recently graduated. Well, not so much anymore. It's been 5 years, but at that moment, it felt like it was more recent. But essentially, I really wanted something that I can utilize the education system with regarding higher education because I know it's vastly different around the world. So it was K through 12, but I really wanted to know what the higher education system was like because it is very unique in Uzbekistan specifically. Because I was at the Journalism and Mass Communications University of Uzbekistan, so the only journalism university in the country, then one of the newest universities in the country at the time, because it opened in 2017 and they had their first graduating class in 2020 to 2023, so around that area. And on top of that, it was supposed to be the freest university in the university in the country because Uzbekistan is still an authoritarian state, sadly. And that is something that they're trying to step away from and they're trying to move away from regarding their press and their journalism. So that's why the university was created. So I wanted to focus on, because when I was writing my application, I didn't know what university I would be placed in. I just knew I would get a university position. So I focused on the education system in Uzbekistan. I also focused on my culture a little bit. I know the personal statement is no longer part of the application, but I think in the statement of grant purpose, there are ways to utilize your educational or personal background to help fulfill that question. And for example, I think I mentioned specifically because my family's Jamaican American, so I mentioned utilizing Jamaican artists such as Bob Marley's Buffalo Soldier and emphasizing how that song could be a way of bridging the gap between Jamaican Americans, Black Americans, but also Uzbek students learning English with a cultural spin that maybe they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So I really emphasized my cultural background in my statement of grant purpose, sorry. And then on top of that, I mentioned just some of my previous teaching experience with Europe, with Princeton Asia, and just like really highlighted how this experience would be a continuation of that through my skills and through my pedagogy, which is still being fine-tuned, but can accommodate a new cultural and educational background. So I really focus on that flexibility piece as well. So I know it's more of a short answer, segmented response, but there are still ways to incorporate yourself and your identity and your potential goals. And I think I mentioned one of the things I actually didn't end up doing, but I mentioned my brother was an English teacher in California at the time. I mentioned doing a kind of like a peer kind of note passing program. That's not how I described it, but essentially it was going to be kind of like an email chain back and forth with a US student and an Uzbek student just so they get more familiar with each other and their culture. Didn't end up happening, but that was something I introduced to kind of show I'm really interested in engaging not just beyond the classroom, but also engaging people from the US that maybe could speak to an experience I can't. So I really emphasize something like that as well in my application.
Aria, I appreciate you talking about the particular materials you suggested you would bring that reflect the way that you want to represent the U.S., your particular background. And I think that's something that, with it being called an ETA, an English teaching assistantship, sometimes people lose sight of the idea that you're not just there to teach English, you're also there to teach about and to represent the US. So you spoke to it, but Jesse, I'm wondering whether Emily has anything that pointed to that, and Brian, if you can speak at all to sort of that side of being an ETA as well, that it's not just a pedagogical question about English instruction, right? It's also like, how did you uniquely approach representing the US? How did you become a conduit for teaching about US culture?
Oh, quickly regarding Emily's application, because you're going to find from country to country, you're going to find a varying degree of specificity. Like some are very targeted. This is the age group, this is the region, this is the city that you're going to be in, and others are so open-ended that it puts the onus on the applicant to make that specificity. For Emily, though, she was coming off of her MBA that she had just completed at Florida State. And the part of the reason why she decided to apply to Spain was because there was an ETA placement at a university that incorporated, amongst other students, business students. And so she had this unique education that she was able to, like, obviously, like Keith said, we're talking about English education, but what makes you like unique for that opportunity? And so what she says is that the university was interested in social justice initiatives, innovation, and holistic learning. I flexed my MBA and shared that I had experience in professional development, and I wanted to help Spanish students apply for international opportunities such as Fulbright. So she kind of inverted the Fulbright experience. So how can I help college students in Spain access a similar type of education elsewhere, whether it be in the United States or another country? And I thought Again, very uniquely suited to the institution and what they were looking for.
Yeah, I love that. And to build on it too, I actually really like all these bridges that are happening. And Aria, I feel like I missed out. I went to FSU way too early because Haitian American, and I remember in my application trying to talk through that experience as well about really being that cultural bridge. So growing up in South Florida, being English, or excuse me, English was my first language, even though Creole was spoken in the home. And so being that kind of conduit and translator from family to community and schools and whatnot, like it was a really, I don't want to say clear bridge, but it was a bridge that I didn't realize that I had until going through the process the second time. Because I also actually applied to Fulbright, I want to say 3 times if we include like the scholars program when you're a sophomore and such to the UK. And I remember that was I was not in the right headspace for being that international liaison, so to speak. And coming back to the application my junior year, a little more petty, thinking, all right, this is going to be it, and trying to go for more of the stats, which they don't advise. Please don't do that. Like the countries that have lower applicants, higher acceptance rates, whatever, because you really truly need to find and make that connection, not just between what you bring to the table, but also like as Emily kind of did with her application, where is that unique alignment that maybe other applicants don't have? That's really kind of what sets you apart. But as you move further with that, I remember in my application really talking through the one that actually was accepted senior year, but really talking through more about what I can offer and try to work through as that liaison. And so in the application, I even talked about school sports programs because of all of my experience with summer camps and trying to use that as a teaching method with students in schools and talking about not just how do we kind of play sports and use that for learning within grammar rules and whatnot, but also how do we maybe learn about professional sports and bridge that gap with growing popularity in basketball and volleyball in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa specifically, to kind of align students to not just what the US might do well, what I bring to the table, but also what really cool things are happening in country themselves that they might not be exposed to. But on the cultural liaison side, one thing that I didn't realize when I was applying that really did show up more when I was in country and I heard in Kenya was that there are a lot of opportunities as well to keep bringing that further. I worked with a teacher, which is an answer to a later question, but was a big highlight for me, who was involved in local theater like hugely and really performed a lot in Nairobi in like the kind of city center. And so we would talk a lot about arts and we would talk about performing arts and bringing that back into the school and me being like an adopter of embracing culture there and try to kind of connect that back to the students or just being in a different community that had a lot of diversity with Kenyans, with Chinese folks, with South Asians, and Indian folks living in Nairobi in the city center where I lived, and just kind of embracing the culture, embracing the language around me, embracing the food, embracing kind of local community habits and those kinds of things. You don't realize it when you're applying, and you probably don't actively think about it, but a lot of the experience is so much more about just connecting with community than just teaching. And that 9-month experience really highlights that.
We can always start. I have some more like pre-experience like questions, but we can get back to those. I want to make sure we have time for like the in-country experience questions as well. And the first one that I have is that initial transition into the country and into the classroom and meeting your students for the first time. Do y'all remember how you had to kind of break the ice and introduce yourselves and kind of jump right into it? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my initial experience in Uzbekistan was very interesting because actually it was not my first time in Uzbekistan at that point. Prior to starting my Fulbright, I actually did a month and a half, 2 month long program in Uzbekistan with the English Speaking Nation Initiative. So it was the US government program where I was teacher training in a different region of Uzbekistan. So if you look at Uzbekistan, it kind of looks like this on a map, right? Tashkent, the capital, is like over here. And that's where my Fulbright placement was because I made sure after I knew I was a finalist for Fulbright, I contacted the embassy, sat down with them via Zoom, and I let them know, I would love to do this opportunity, but I've had a very difficult time in Kyrgyzstan, not in the classroom, but mainly outside the classroom. I could speak to a little bit more. And I told them I would love to do this, but I cannot do this in a smaller city or region because I just know me looking like this is going to be a lot, right? And of course, I said it more diplomatically. Let's say I said it more diplomatically. And they were like, oh, yeah, no, it won't be the same at all. You'll be A-okay. Anyway, we're going to place you in the capital anyway. So you should be okay. We'll be right there. Embassy will be right there. You'll be fine, right? In fact, I was not fine. But they at least had the idea in mind, which I do appreciate. So prior to that, in Uzbekistan, I was on the other side of Uzbekistan, kind of right over here, in the autonomous region called Pakistan, which is very similar to think of the autonomous regions of like native reservations in the US, is essentially that. This is a whole community of a different language, culture, different way practicing Islam, right? A different way of navigating the social space than someone from Tashkent. So I was teacher training there for about a month and a half, and I had a little bit of familiarity with Uzbek culture through that experience, although Kalakalpak people are not Uzbek, right? So then I came back through Fulbright and I started in Tashkent, knowing I would stay in Tashkent, whereas all of us, we did eight in-country orientation and then eventually splintered off from there. So everyone went to their respective cities or regions to start their Fulbright program. I remember for me, because the laws changed in real time, that happens a lot, and apparently I was there sort of illegally for about yeah, let's say half a day. So I couldn't move into my apartment or get registered because they were like, you can't register. We don't have like, there's a gap in your presence and it does not look right for this specific authority. So I had to cross the border. Yeah. So I had to cross the border from Uzbekistan to Kyrgyzstan. My university, I had a point of contact at the time and he was kind of guiding everything. So he drove me to the border, crossing the Kyrgyzstan. I timed it for about 5 minutes because I've been to Kyrgyzstan up to that point, not Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan up to that point. And I was like, I remember my time in Kazakhstan. I don't need to be here longer than 5 minutes right now, right? So I went back into Uzbekistan, had a little problem getting back into Uzbekistan because they withheld my passport and they were saying it wasn't me. And I basically had to call the US Embassy to vouch for myself to say, I am from the US. This is my passport. I just want to go to my apartment, right? So basically, I had a little bit of a kerfuffle getting my registration and documents done. But my university, I think knowing all of that, we're actually very receptive and very kind. Because it's a journalism university, there's also a lot of pictures and photographs. And me, I'm not a picture and photograph person. It's something I really don't like. In the beginning, I was like, why was I placed here? Is this some sort of joke that I'm placed in the place where everyone records everything, right? So when I initially arrived, there was a lot of recordings, a lot of pictures, a lot of photo ops, but also there was a lot of warmth and kindness, and there were a lot of people really happy to have me. The prior ET before me was a man, and in Uzbekistan, there is still a gender divide for a lot of different things. So they were really excited to have a woman because I was more easily able to work with different co-teachers, and they were really comfortable with me because of that. So I think that there was a lot of elements to my experience in the first initial week that I think was very touch and go. But I think ultimately the greeting and the warmth from my university and the students were very excited as well. Although a lot of them thought I was from Africa, which I was like, that's not how this program works here. It would be cool if I was, but my family's from the other side of the world. It was definitely a very interesting aspect of introducing myself into a new country. I'll say that. Yeah.
It's a heck of a story to have, though. It's not stressful. But your story emphasizes for my transition, like one of the big things I would advise for everyone, which is get close to and almost cling to those points of contact, whether it is your host institution, school, or your embassy. And with the embassy piece, I would emphasize too, I know not everyone is going to have close proximity to their host country's embassy when they get out there. But those points of contact are really key for those moments where it's something like figuring out passports, visas, or making sure they validate where you're at and all that. I certainly, with the pre-orientation, got lucky in my group because we were one of the only ones, the folks going to Kenya at the time, that had our embassy contacts who came to that pre-departure orientation. So we got to meet them a little bit earlier, exchange contact information on WhatsApp and such, and then via email and WhatsApp in the months leading up to, I was just every question that I had just to prepare. I'm even practicing Kiswahili a bit to try to like practice greetings like highs and buys just to make sure, hey, is this proper? Is this how we use whatnot? Etiquette and all of that. And then when it came to actually getting on site, I recall we spent some time at the embassy, which was in Nairobi, Kenya, so easier for my group because we were, again, hosted there. But again, got reoriented to who their staff was, had an initial meet and greet with the school principal that I was at, as well as some of the other instructors. Similar to Aria, it was certainly outside of like some of the prep stuff, just complete exposure to something very different. I remember when I was applying, I was naively at the time thinking, Black man, I want to be in a Black country around other folks that are kind of like me. But of course, you get there and it's significantly different cultural history, people, dialects, even groups and such. And so I remember actually feeling incredibly isolated my own design in a lot of ways in that first month or two because a lot of the difference and a lot of the change was more jarring than I expected. And so I definitely showed up to the school and to meet the other instructors and the principal, fully polite, trying to practice Kiswahili as much as I can. But I did struggle to take advantage of that community and the folks who were willing to offer help and guidance early. And I would certainly encourage y'all take advantage of that because for the most part, especially once you get through all of the hoops to actually get to the host country as a finalist, as a Fulbrighter, like folks want to make sure that you are successful, if not for your own sake, then of course for the embassy's sake, for the program's sake, for the students in the school's sake. Like folks are interested in making sure you're successful. And so once I locked in, so to speak, a couple months in and realized like, hey, let's take advantage of these communities, let's embrace it. And let's try to also connect with community, connect with the people again, through the language, through dialogue, through some of the like local customs and all of that. It it flowed much better, but you truly have to, I don't want to say when in Rome, but really embrace where you're going and embrace the culture to make that connection happen.
Emily's story echoes elements of both of what you're saying, which I really appreciate. But Brian, kind of in a similar vein, Emily, as a native Spanish speaker, when she started in Spain, she quickly realized that the English that her students studied was British English, and so her American accent made it much more, even though native Spanish speaker, those dialect differences like made it a lot harder for her to be understood. And Aria, Emily speaks to on her very first day getting off at the wrong bus stop, therefore being late to class, walking in very sweaty, out of breath. And so I think it's just simply important to remember that, life is messy at times, but, you keep pushing forward, advocate for yourself. Fulbright does provide structure and support, but remember that you are your best advocate. And then you just kind of got to take the punches as they come, but anyways, the next question that I have was regarding your partner teacher. So a lot of Fulbright applicants in their application, speak to, like we've been discussing, pedagogical approaches and nuances or materials that you would like to use in the classroom. But was your partner teacher receptive to your ideas, your teaching style that you outlined in your application? If so, how did they support you in incorporating those ideas? Or if not, how did you navigate the situation to remain respectful, but still true to the application that you submitted?
I can kill on, so yeah, perfect. I remember reading this question and thinking like, they better have been receptive, but like more facetiously, because it was just me. Like I got in and didn't really have a partner instructor. And so I'll set the stage for you all. It was for the Kenya cohort going to Nairobi, four of us who were ETAs, and we actually all stayed in the same apartment. So we were roommates just to make the transition smoother. Two of the women that were in that in the apartment who were ETAs taught and co-taught at the same school. All girls school, part of the same network of private schools that I taught at, but I was at an all boys school by myself, all boys Muslim school as well, private. And so very, very different structurally and also denominationally from what I was used to. But I remembered when I came in that it was more on a semester cycle. And so this changed from first to second. But when I first come in, I had, I want to say, a couple of classes with first year students teaching English. And I remember when the school schedule was assigned to me, I was kind of thinking, are you sure you want just me in there with all these boys? Like, and it was like first, second year boys. So and all also staying at the same school, same dorm. And so it was very much like a lot of charged energy. And it was in Nairobi in Kenya, what's it called? Discipline, like corporal punishment, all that outlawed, especially in the public schools, but not as heavily enforced in private schools. And so I remember thinking, I'm coming into this classroom or a few classrooms by myself with young men, and I have my own values, my own approach to education, my own approach to discipline that is very, very different from the teachers that I instructed with around me. And it was a challenge because I had to recognize very quickly, kind of as Jesse points out, that I am the guest in this host environment. And as long as I'm there, I mean, within a 9-month period, I'm not going to fully change the structure of the school, the administration, the processes, the rules, any of that. And so I have to figure out how to reconcile my approach to instruction, my approach to connecting with students with the culture that they're already in. And it was a challenge because a lot of the students definitely noticed like I was going to be relatively like more lenient, more of the chill teacher, so to speak, coming from the US, not really being too heavily enforcing on physical discipline. And so there was a lot more acting up in my classroom early on that I struggled with more than the instruction side and the pedagogy side. But what worked for me in that case was because I had a lot more of that autonomy in class, being able to connect with them and then translate the curriculum and translate the instruction in a way that worked for me and them, being a little bit more creative with that ingenuity piece, like Emily talked about. So bringing music into class with after school programs, engaging with the students on sports with like poetry and whatnot, which is really, really cool. But for the two women who co-instructed at their institution, they had a little bit more of a challenge because they, despite being together, had a bit more of a workload and a bit more kind of tension between them and some of the other instructors. And I remember we'd come back home because my schedule would have a class in the morning, maybe class in the afternoon. And so for lesson planning, I really had all day to kind of like in between, just like figure out how do I want to adjust curriculum, how do I want to take over things in my way. But they would come home together, lesson plan in the evenings around dinner and whatnot, kind of talk about how they're going to approach it. And then they also worked with some other teachers. And so it was a lot more negotiating with them. But one of the things I found was most of these teachers, not just with us in Kenya, but then some of the other sub-Saharan ETAs, they're pretty excited about having you in the class and really in a lot of ways like offloading some of that work and having some more support in the classroom. And so they'll embrace your ideas for sure and be open to partnering. If anything, if you're worried about it, even being able to say, ask like, hey, I want to take over this bit, or I'd like to have a little bit more practice and instruct in this bit. Most teachers are receptive to that. So do trust yourself again. If you make it that far, folks want you to be involved in the process. So do embrace it, but don't be too worried about making it fit your style a little bit.
I feel like a lot of my experience, although paralleled parts of Brian's, was also, I would say, very heavily co-teacher focused actually, because I think for my program, they were very heavily focused on making sure that we co-taught and none of us were teaching in classrooms alone. They were very much hammering home self-advocacy. So for example, if a teacher just wanted to, let's say, step out of the classroom because they were like, oh, you're in there, you can handle it. Basically putting your foot down in a way, respectfully and culturally for that context and saying, I'm not allowed to co-teach, right? And like they always said, if there was ever a problem, just use the excuse of the embassy and say, the embassy said I can't do this. So it's definitely one of those things I think my school was really receptive for because it was their second ETA, the person prior to me. He was also, I think, I didn't really connect with him too much because, of course, there was not too much overlap, but I think he had a really good co-teaching structure and schedule for himself. But it was different though because he had no teaching background and I did. So his structure, they tried applying to me saying that, oh, he worked with all of the English department as a co-teacher. And in my mind, I was like, whoa, I can't do that. Because when I lesson plan, it's very specific to the section and the unit, and each co-teacher is teaching something different depending on what year the students are in. They could be learning conversational English, academic English, or specifically journalism English. So it's like there are different specific categories they have to focus on. And then on top of that, it was also just very different because the university had two tracks, an Uzbek track and a Russian track. And I can kind of eavesdrop in Russian at that point, right? But my Uzbek eavesdropping was non-existent at that point. So I was like, I don't know what anyone is saying for anything, right? So I can kind of pick up clues for Russian, but when it came to Uzbek, I didn't get it just in the beginning. Toward the end, it was a little bit better. And my co-teacher, who I did eventually have a primary co-teacher, and she's wonderful. The first time when I kind of started picking up something, someone asked if they can like borrow a phone. And I was like, yeah, you can use mine, right? And they're like, you know Uzbek? I'm like, no, I don't. I'm using context clues. That is not me knowing this language fluently. I wish I did. But it was definitely one of those things where I had to navigate the language and the cultural, and also there was also religious aspects to the classroom as well. although the university was, I would say, fairly progressive for other universities in Uzbekistan, there were still elements to it that were still Uzbek government run. So, for example, in October 2023, when the Hamas attack and the Israel-Palestine conflict started, the school made a concerted effort to say, you cannot wear or have yourself presented a certain way. So men had to shave all their facial hair, and women were not allowed to wear black hijabs. And that was something that I found very, very interesting because this was supposed to be a public university and socially very liberal, but at the same time, they also did not want to be associated with the extremist elements of Islam, and they made it very specific regarding students. They would be pulling students out of the classroom, or they would be going class to class to see if people were following this new dress code. And a lot of teachers and students were frustrated with it, but a lot of them didn't feel like they could say anything, especially teachers, because at the university, you can really have everything documented. Because it's a journalism university, there is always a phone or a camera or something being recorded or filmed. So a lot of teachers have felt very nervous to kind of confront certain students or say certain things out of the fear of backlash coming from that specific interaction. So there was often times where I would be with a co-teacher because I eventually narrowed it down to just a few I kind of rotated between. And there would be times where they didn't feel comfortable saying certain things, but I could because I was that guest, I was that foreigner. And that was something that I tried to leverage a little bit, especially when I felt like students weren't respecting my co-teachers, because there were definitely times where students just felt like, oh, English, easy stuff. I could learn, like, I could just take 2 years of English and then start studying in the US. And it's like, no, there's so much more that comes into this language that needs to be done. And I think a lot of my co-teachers are really receptive to the things I brought into the classroom, the music, the games, the group activities, because a lot of them really thought, one, it was engaging and exciting, not for just the students, but for them. But they also felt like this is something that should be used because it really makes English feel like a language that is applicable. It's not just in the textbook anymore. It comes to life when you can engage with it, when you can interact with it, when you know someone who can speak it and understand it in a way that can be shared back. It was really something that I think helped a lot of my co-teachers understand the importance of it outside the classroom as well. And I did some teacher trainings. No, the schedule kind of fell off, but at least when it did happen, I think they were really engaged to know some of these teaching methodologies I was introducing.
Emily's advice on this question is to think of your application as theory, and then once you're in country, you have to adapt and be practical. Also, being in a university setting, Emily mentioned that there was just so many ideas in an already packed syllabus that primarily what she was doing was helping her teacher implement that curriculum. There were opportunities to get involved in the community and work in fundraising and work with communities of need, which she did speak to in the application, but it was more so, I'm here to support. So whatever you need, put me where you need me, and we'll get the job done. And I think I have one more question, and then have some time at the end, for any of our attendees to ask. Sorry, let me find that. I lost my place in the form. Here we go. Can you both share some of the more memorable, teachable moments that you recall from your experience in the classroom? What are some takeaways, pieces of advice, or tell us more about the experience beyond just the teaching aspect, perhaps?
Yeah, I could start that one off. Oh, sorry, Brian, you unmuted as well. Feel free. Okay, nose goes. Gotcha. For me, I think a lot of the experiences within the classroom that went beyond the teaching was really just that human to human connection. I think a lot of students prior to me had never seen a Black person before, let alone a Black American. And there were a lot of assumptions about where I was from because of how I looked. Again, for the first 3 months. 3 months, they thought I was from Africa. And this is after I have literally went through and would open up Google Maps and would show maps of the US and show maps of South Florida where I was from and show maps of Jamaica because, it's right there and showing them all these different things, right? Just for my co-teacher to tell me, oh, we don't really learn maps like that. And I was like, oh. Okay, let me try another method, right? Or trying to explain the difference between British and American English, and a lot of my students learning English, of course, as a second language, not really getting exposure to both of these different ways of speaking English, not realizing what type of English I was speaking. So after presenting British and American English, I remember a student, she raised her hand kind of meekly and she's like, "Are you speaking British or American English?" And I'm just like, "Oh, bless your heart. I am American. It's American English, you know? So it's like one of those things where I was very aware of just how much of a gap I was kind of filling in for a lot of different things: identity, culture, geography, general history of the US, because a lot of people were not aware of certain things regarding US history. Or, for example, when Black History Month rolled around, me being the only Black ETA, I think the embassy was very confused about what to do. They didn't know if they could ask me to present something, and I was like, you could have, instead of them having the white and Asian ETAs present Black history. I was like, you guys had a huge opportunity and you dropped the ball a lot. That happened a lot with my embassy. They just dropped the ball quite a bit for a lot of things. I remember having to volunteer and saying, I wouldn't mind speaking about the Black experience. I know I don't know everything about it, but I think I have some idea, you know? So I remember making an embassy presentation. So this was outside the classroom, and also one for my students explaining Black history, because a lot of them weren't aware, one, Black people existed in the US, or if they did, that racism, oh, it was dead and gone. Martin Luther King made a speech. Everything's great. And I'm like, no, but it's okay. That's why I'm here. We'll talk about it, right? So I think I really made an effort of kind of letting students know my identity, because a lot of them are very interested in going to the US. And a part of me was very focused on, if you're really interested in this country, you have to know about it. You can't assume the US is just a place of like honey and gold. Because I think a lot of students assumed it was kind of like an amusement park, like Disney World, where it's like, oh, it's gonna be fun, we'll do this and we'll do that. But it's like, no, it's a country like anywhere else. There are problems, there are issues, there are people that are struggling, just like in any other country. And I wanted my students to really grasp the understanding of the US as a country and not just a concept. That was a really big thing for me, because I knew that part of being ETA is that cross-cultural connection. And our embassy was very vocal about us being open about our experiences, not having to advocate for the US as a mouthpiece. And I really did appreciate that, because I could have been more candid and open about certain things. And so were my fellow ETAs. They talked about like Native American genocide during Thanksgiving, right? Or like Christopher Columbus not really being the founder of the US, like other things that maybe in another program that wouldn't have been discussed or maybe wouldn't have been thought of representing the US. Like we really made sure to show that it is a place that has this history. Are you ready for that? So I think that was something that I really focused on, as well as just making English more lively outside the classroom. I always had clubs. I had 4 clubs: karaoke club, frisbee club, movie club, and English speaking club. And I really emphasized my students, I'm like, if you want more practice, join my clubs. I can accommodate. I can do it twice a week. I can do this and that. Let's see what we can do. And then ultimately, just kind of making myself more of a presence on campus was very important, because I think a lot of people heard about me but didn't know me. And I think that really was something I was trying to bridge the gap for. So people felt more comfortable just talking to me and not seeing me as this like this foreign faculty member, but someone who's really a part of the community. So that was some elements of my experience outside the classroom as well.
I want to build off the club's idea because you really don't appreciate how big of an opportunity that is to like have the connection and impact with students until you're there. And I'd hinted at this a bit in my application, but outside of just the lesson planning, you kind of talked about this briefly too, Aria. For a lot of the students that I worked with, they didn't have that same excitement or zeal for English as I expected, which hindsight does make sense. But when I connected with these students and spoke with them, a lot of them they were really cool, really interested, wanted to go out and be like medical professionals, engineers. A lot of them really wanted to be pilots, which is like a popular thing apparently. But when you thought about like their options and what they wanted to do, like English really fell low on that priority scale as far as like what they need to advance. And for many of these students, of course, being where I was, right on the kind of central east coast of Africa, they had certainly great understanding of Kiswahili as like a native primary language. And then a lot of them from different tribes in Kenya had like their tribal tongues as well. So more of like a second language. Many of them were picking up even Chinese from a lot of the investors who were in the community and area. And so I'm coming in with a new language and saying, hey, let's learn this. This is great. And a lot of students were like, all right, it's part of the curriculum. We're here. We'll show up. It's on the schedule. But it was really through the after school programs, connecting with them in basketball. I ended up coaching basketball for like a school program there. So I got a lot more practice playing with the students just more naturally. Or with that instructor that I talked about, who I shadowed a little bit at the start, who was involved in community theater for after school clubs tied to poetry and tied to drama and performance. We'd bring scripts back from him and kind of read that out to the students because his plays, a lot of them were in English too. And so it was really cool finding different unique ways within the existing I guess, framework to add in different ways to make English learning fun and practice fun. And that was big. I would say there are a spattering of different, I guess, memorable moments. That was certainly like one of the big things we had just for connection with the students. But as you put it too, like the community engagement is truly that big piece that you don't recognize or realize is going to be a big hallmark of your 9 months. We had luckily some exposure to this program, some sub-Saharan African leaders from the, I want to say, Mandela Washington program, it was fellowship, which takes a lot of young leaders within sub-Saharan Africa, brings them to the US for more exposure and whatnot. But a lot of them, they were also in Nairobi for a period. And I remember they'd organize like this river cleanup kind of experience within the city, like closer to one of the slum areas. And so just getting out into the community, volunteering with them, connecting, talking about some of their ideas, talking about the US, but then also just connecting in that space was huge. I remember also thinking, that naively going over, oh, a lot of really famous like international runners, like marathoners, like really big culture of running out there, which is such a privilege. Like we get out into the city, and of course, I'm trying to think, like, I don't know if I ever saw folks just casually running, like a handful maybe in the 9 months in my community. Like a lot of that isn't as common. The city did organize some type of race that I was able to run in just because it was going on and my roommate was a big runner. But there was another opportunity to just get into the community. Nairobi also had like this jazz festival going on, like my second month in there. And I think that was one of those moments where I thought there's just so much rich culture, art, is people, vibrancy here that I didn't know about and expect. And when I think back to the experience outside of what happened in the classroom, just being able to connect and embrace not just with that, but the people who put a lot of this on or kind of shared some of that information really made it more of that highlight. And again, it brings us back to that point of, again, it's really that cultural liaisoning, like whatever the right word is, within this experience outside of just the instruction that makes it so full.
To quickly share Emily's perspective on this, because I really think it's a unique experience given her placement. But the most memorable moment for her was her supplemental project, which some ETAs have. So even though she taught at a university in Madrid, she held a supplemental professional development course. And most of the students there were women in Afghanistan. Due to the politics of Afghan women's ability to receive education, they always had to have their cameras off due to safety and privacy concerns. That semester strengthened Emily's love for education. She was able to recognize how women in other parts of the world are actively denied their education and access to it. It made her appreciate having this in her day-to-day life for the 10 months of her Fulbright career. And so I think it echoes, that even though you're going to, even though in Spain, you may not be thinking of all of the communities and culture and people that are represented there, but that's going to be for any country, that you apply to. So do your research, before you go into that city, that culture, that community, and I think you can find some pretty unique ways to engage. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we have a few minutes left, and so if there's any quick questions that people have, feel free to ask, and we'll go from there. One quick one that I have is now in hindsight, is there a quick piece of advice that you would give for someone about to take on this endeavor? For now, the application, but later we can talk about the actual experience itself.
My quick advice is just don't be afraid to tell your story. That's it.
Oh, Brian, you're muted. So sorry.
Thank you. No, I thought I unmuted. But in addition to what Arya mentioned, I will say from my experience applying 3 times and 3 times a charm, have a backup plan is like one of the big things I would say. It certainly is an incredibly competitive opportunity. And I will echo, because I went through this, If you're certainly very adamant about this experience as something that will help you kind of connect to the next step, be that cultural liaison and whatnot, certainly pursue it by all means. But because of the timeline for the application, I believe it opens up October of this year. But then when we applied and we submitted October or so, the first decision came in January or so, and then I'd accepted an offer for like grad school, and then the next day was informed about the placement in like April that year, and then we didn't leave until January the following year. And so there's certainly a good bit of you got to have that planning and have that big picture, certainly pursue it. But if you are worried about, hey, this is a timeline from when I apply to when I actually start, have some other options in mind for things that you want to do to enrich that experience, whether it's like kind of Aria did, other ways of instructing, other ways of engaging in the community, other ways of studying, whatever that looks like, whatever it means to you. But consider this as maybe that step in your journey as opposed to, all right, this is a culminating thing of everything.
Mhm. And yeah, Aria, I think you answered Chris's question pretty accurately. There are some placements that will specify they want to see teaching experience, or they want to see that you have some established, so you may take on more autonomous, teaching responsibilities. But I would say for many positions, it's going to be kind of in a partnership role. So definitely go through and read the fine print on these pages. There's going to be some similarities, but you might find, and the one that I always point to, or at least used to point to, for the ETA placement in Spain, is at the very bottom of an extremely dense page. There's like one sentence that says, this is what the first sentence of your statement of purpose needs to say. And well, obviously, if you submit your application and it doesn't say that, which is essentially for Spain, is this is my placement, this is the age group I prefer to work with, you're giving. So my point is, read the fine print. Maybe that's changed for this current cycle, but for at least the last 10 years, the Spain ETA was always my go-to example. But I know we're running low on time, and I want to make sure to take time to thank Brian, Aria, and Emily's thoughts and perspective for being here today. We so truly appreciate you sharing this experience. I think it makes our job as advisors easier, and I think it makes the task for our applicants a little bit less daunting. But thank you so much for being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank y'all.
Bye, friend.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.
Yeah, and thank you for waking up so early, Aria.
Yeah, I got work in a few hours.
Yeah. See ya. Bye, friend.
Bye.
Cool. Thanks, Keith.
Take care.